Voice and Phenomenon by Jacques Derrida. Translated from the French by Leonard Lawlor. Read by Jacob Flanagan. Chapter 1. Sign and Signs. Husserl begins by pointing out a confusion. Within the word sign, always in ordinary language and at times in philosophical language, are hidden two heterogeneous concepts, that of expression, which we often mistakenly hold as being the synonym of the sign in general, and that of indication. Sign. Now, according to Husserl, there are some signs that express nothing because these signs carry, we must still say this in German, nothing that we can call Bedeutung. This is what indication is. Certainly indication is a sign, like expression, but it is different from expression because it is insofar as it is an indication deprived of Bedeutung. Sign. This is what indication is. Certainly indication is a sign, like expression, but it is different from expression because it is, insofar as it is indication, deprived of Bedeutung. Sign. Bedeutunglos, or sinnlos. Nevertheless, it is not a sign without signification. Essentially, there cannot be a sign without signification, a signifier without a signified. This is why the traditional translation of Bedeutung by signification, although it is established and nearly inevitable, risks blurring Husserl's entire text, rendering it unintelligible in its axial intention, and consequently rendering unintelligible all of what will depend on these first essential distinctions. One can say with Husserl in German, without absurdity, that a sign, Zeichen, is deprived of Bedeutung, is bedeutunglos, is not bedeutsam. But one cannot say in French without contradiction that un Sinn is deprived of signification. In German one can speak of expression, Ausdruck, and bedeutsamen Zeichen, which Husserl does. One cannot, without redundancy, translate bedeutsame Zeichen into French as Sinn significant, which lets us imagine against the evidence and against Husserl's intention that we could have des signes non significants. While being suspicious of these established French translations, we must nevertheless confess that it will always be difficult to replace them. This is why our remarks are nothing less than criticisms aimed at the existing valuable translations. We shall try nevertheless to propose some solutions which will keep to being halfway between commentary and translation. They will thus be valid only within the limits of Husserl's texts. Most often when we are confronting a difficulty, we shall, according to the procedure whose value is at times contestable, retain the German word while attempting to clarify it by means of the analysis. In this way, it will be very quickly confirmed that, for Husserl, the expressivity of the expression, which assumes the identity of a Bedeutung, has an irreducible link to the possibility of a spoken discourse, Rede. Expression is purely linguistic sign in the first analysis. This is precisely what distinguishes it from indication. Although spoken discourse is a very complex structure, involving always, in fact, an indicative layer which we shall see, we shall have the greatest trouble trying to hold within its limits. Husserl reserves for it the exclusivity of the right to expression and therefore the exclusivity of pure logicity. Without violating Husserl's intention, one could define, if not translate, bedeuten by vouloir dire, at once in the sense of speaking subject that wants to say, expressing himself, as Husserl says, about something, and in the sense of an expression that means. We can then be assured that Bedeutung is always what someone or a discourse means, voulant dire, always a sense of discourse, a discursive content. In contrast to Frege, Husserl, as we know, does not distinguish in the logical investigations between the sign and the Bedeutung. Besides, for us, Bedeutung means the same thing as sign, gilt als gleichbedeutend mit Sein. On the one hand, it is very convenient, especially in this case of this concept, to have one's disposal parallel interchangeable terms, particularly since the sense of the term Bedeutung itself is to be investigated. A further consideration is our ingrained habit to use these two words as meaning the same thing. In these conditions, it seems a rather dubious step if the Bedeutungen are differentiated, as Gottfried Frege has proposed, we use one Bedeutung in our sense and the other for the objects expressed. In Ideas 1, the dissociation that intervenes between the two terms does not at all have the same function as in Frege, and it confirms our reading that Bedeutung is reserved for the ideal sense of verbal expression of spoken discourse, while sense sign covers the whole noematic sphere, including its non-expressive stratum. Quote, we begin with the familiar distinction between the sensuous so to speak, corporeal side of expression and its non-sensuous or spiritual side. We need not enter into a closer examination of the first side. Likewise, we need not consider the manner of unifying both sides. Obviously, they too designate headings for not unimportant phenomenological problems. We shall restrict our regard exclusively to signifying bedeuten and bedeutung. Originally, these words concerned only the linguistic sphere, sprachliche Sphäre, and of expressing, des Ausdruckens. But one can scarcely avoid and, at the same time, take an important cognitive step extending the Bedeutung of these words and suitably modifying them so that they can find application of a certain kind to the whole noetico-noematic sphere, thus application to all acts, be they now interwoven, verflochten, with expressive acts or not. We have continued to speak of sense, sign. In the case of all intentional lived experience, a word is used in general as an equivalent to Bedeutung. For the sake of distinctness, we shall prefer the term Bedeutung for the old concept, and in particular in the complex locution of logical Bedeutung or expressive Bedeutung. We shall continue to use the word sense as before in the most all-inclusive range. After having asserted in a passage to which we shall have to return that there exists a pre-expressive stratum of lived experience or sense, then that this stratum of sense could always receive expression in Bedeutung, Husserl proposes that logical Bedeutung is an expression. The difference between indication and expression appears very quickly over the course of the description, as a difference that is more functional than substantial. Indication and expression are functions or signifying relations and not terms. One and the same phenomenon can be approached as expression or as indication, as a discursive sign or a non-discursive sign. That depends on the intentional lived experience that animates it. The functional character of the description immediately shows the extent of the difficulty and gets us right to its center. Two functions can be interwoven or entangled in the same concatenation of signs and the same signification. Husserl speaks first of the addition or of the juxtaposition of one function with the other. Quote, signs in the sense of indication, Einzeichen, notes, marks, etc., do not express unless they fulfill, in addition to Husserl's emphasis, neben, the indicative function, a function of Bedeutung. But a few lines later he will speak of intimate intrication and entanglement, Verflechtung. This word will reappear often at decisive moments, and this will not be by chance. It appears already in the first section, meaning, bedeuten, vouloir dire, in communicative discourse, in Mitleider Rede, is always interwoven, verflochten, in a relation with this indication being. We therefore already know that, in fact, the discursive sign and consequently the meaning, le vouloir dire, is always entangled, gripped within an indicative system. The expressive and logical purity of the Bedeutung that Husserl wants to grasp as the possibility of the logos is gripped, that is, contaminated in fact and always, allzeit verflochten ist, insofar as the Bedeutung is gripped within a communicative discourse. Of course, as we shall see, communication itself is for Husserl a stratum that is extrinsic to expression, but each time that an expression is produced in fact, it carries a communicative value. Even if the expression does not exhaust itself in communication, or if this value is simply associated with it. It will be necessary to specify the modalities of this interweaving, but it is clear from now on that this factual necessity of entanglement, which intimately associates expression and indication, must not, in Husserl's eyes, undermine the possibility of a rigorous essential distinction. This possibility is purely juridical and phenomenological. The whole analysis will move forward, therefore, in this hiatus between fact and right, existence and essence, reality and the intentional function. By leaping over the mediations and by reversing the apparent order, we would be tempted to say that this hiatus, which defines the very space of phenomenology, does not pre-exist the question of language, and is not inserted into phenomenology as within one domain or as one problem among others. It is opened up, on the contrary, only in and by the possibility of language, and its juridical value, the right to a distinction between fact and intentional right, depends entirely on language, and in language, on the validity of a radical distinction between indication and expression. Let us pursue our reading. Every expression would therefore be gripped, despite itself, by an indicative process. But the opposite, Husserl recognizes, is not true. We might therefore be tempted to turn the expressive sign into a species of the genus indication. In this case, we would have to say that in the end, that speech whatever the dignity or whatever the originality we still grant it, is only a form of gesture, in its essential center, and not only by means of what Husserl considers as its accidents, its physical side, its communicative function. Speech belongs, without exceeding it, to the general system of signification. This system would be merged with the system of indication. This is precisely what Husserl contests. In order to do that, he must, therefore, demonstrate that expression is not a species of indication, even though all expressions are mixed with indication, the reverse not being true. Husserl writes, if one limits oneself to expressions employed in living colloquy, as one usually does involuntarily when expression is in question, the concept of an indication seems to apply more widely than that of an expression, but this does not mean that its content is the genus of which an expression is the species. To mean, bedeuten, vouloir dire, is not a particular species of sign being, Zeichenseins, in the sense of an indication, Einzeige. It has a narrower application only because meaning, bedeuten, in communicative discourse is always entangled, verflochten, with indication being, Anzeigseinen, and this in turn leads to a wider concept, since meaning is also capable of occurring outside of this entanglement. In order to demonstrate the rupture of the species-genus relation, we then have to rediscover if there is any phenomenological situation in which expression is no longer tied up in this entanglement, is no longer interwoven with indication. Since this contamination is always produced in real colloquy, at once because in real colloquy expression indicates a content that is forever hidden from the intuition, namely lived experience of the other, and because the ideal content of the Bedeutung and the spiritual side of the expression are united in real colloquy with the sensible side, it is in language without communication, in a monological discourse, in the absolutely lowest register of the voice of the solitary life of the soul, in einem Seelenleben, that is necessary to track down the unmarred purity of expression. Through a strange paradox, the meaning, le vouloir dire, would isolate the concentrated purity of expressivity only when the relation to a certain outside would be suspended, only to a certain outside, because this reduction will not erase and indeed shall reveal in pure expressivity the relation to the object, the aim of an objective ideality, over and against the intention of meaning, vouloir dire, and over and above the Bedeutungsintention. What we just called a paradox is in truth only the phenomenological project in its essence. Beyond the opposition between idealism and realism, subjectivism and objectivism, etc., phenomenological transcendental idealism responds to the necessity to describe the objectivity of the object, Gegenstand, and the presence of the present, Gegenwart, and the objectivity in presence on the basis of an interiority, or rather on the basis of a self-proximity, of an ownness, Eigenheit, which is not a simple inside, but the intimate possibility of the relation to an over there, to an outside in general. This is why the essence of intentional consciousness will be revealed, for example, in Ideas section 49, only in the reduction of the totality of the existing world in general. This movement is already sketched in the first logical investigation in relation to expression and meaning, vouloir dire, as being a relation to the object. Husserl says, expressions unfold their function of meaning, Bedeutungsfunktion, function de vouloir dire, even in the solitary life of the soul, where they no longer function as indications. In truth, therefore, the two concepts of sign are not really related to one another as concepts that are wider or narrower. Before opening this field of the solitary life of the soul in order to recover expressivity in it, it is necessary, therefore, to determine and reduce the domain of indication. This is what Husserl begins by doing. But before following him in this analysis, let us pause for a moment. The movement that we just commented upon is actually open to two possible readings. On the one hand, Husserl seems to repress with a dogmatic haste a question about the structure of the sign in general by proposing from the start a radical dissociation between two heterogeneous types of sign, between indication and expression. He does not ask himself what the sign in general is. The concept of sign in general, which he has to use at the beginning and to which he would have to grant a hearthstead of sense, is able to receive its unity only from an essence. The general concept can be patterned on the essence, and the essence must be recognized in an essential structure of experience and in the familiarity of a horizon. In order to hear the word sign at the opening of the problematic, we must already have a relation of pre-understanding with essence, the function, or the essential structure of the sign in general. Then, however, we will be able to eventually distinguish between the sign as indication and the sign as expression, even if the two types of sign are not ordered according to the relations of genus and species. According to a distinction which is itself Husserlian, confer First Logical Investigations, section 13. One can say that the category of the sign in general is not a genus, but rather a form. What therefore is a sign in general? For many reasons, our ambition is not to answer this question. We only want to suggest that sense in which Husserl may seem to evade it. Every sign is a sign for something, for etwas. These are Husserl's first words, the words that immediately introduce the dissociation of expression from indication. But not every sign has a Bedeutung, a sense, a sign, that the sign expresses. This presupposes that we knew implicitly that being for means in the sense of being in the place of. We must understand, in a familiar way, this structure of substitution or of referral, so that in this structure the heterogeneity between indicative referral and expressive referral becomes consequently intelligible, indeed demonstrated, and even so that the evidentness of their relation comes to be accessible for us, perhaps in the sense in which Husserl hears it. A little later, in section 8, Husserl will in fact demonstrate that expressive referral, hinzulenken and hinzeigen, is not indicative referral, anzeigen. But no original question is formed about zeigen in general, which, pointing the finger in this way at the invisible, can then be modified into hinzeigen or into anzeigen. However, we can already guess, and perhaps we shall later verify it, that this zeigen is the place in which the root and the necessity of all the entanglements between indication and expression are announced. Zeigen is the place in which all the oppositions and differences that will henceforth crisscross Husserl's analysis, and this will be wholly formed within the concepts of traditional metaphysics, are not yet sketched out. But in Husserl, choosing the logic of signification as his theme, believing already that he is able to isolate the logical a priori from pure grammar within the general a priori of grammar, is resolutely engaged in some of the modifications of the general structure of zeigen, hinzeigen, not anzeigen. Does this absence of a question in regard to the starting point and the pre-understanding of an operative concept necessarily translate into a dogmatism? On the other hand, may we not interpret this as critical vigilance? Is not what is at issue precisely the rejection or erasure of pre-understanding as the apparent starting point, indeed its rejection or erasure as a kind of prejudice or presumption? By what right may we presume that the essential unity of something like the sign? And what if Husserl wanted to break up the unity of the sign, to demonstrate that it has a unity only in appearance, to reduce it to a verbality without concept? And what if we were not one concept of sign and several types of sign, but two irreducible concepts which we have improperly attached one sole word? At the beginning of the section, Husserl speaks precisely of two concepts attached to the word sign. By blaming him for not beginning with an interrogation of the sign being of the sign in general, are we not trusting in a rather hasty way the unity of a word? More seriously, by asking what is the sign in general, we subordinate the question of the sign to an ontological design. We claim to assign to signification a place which might be fundamental or regional within an ontology. This would be a classical way of proceeding. We would subordinate the sign to truth, language to being, speech to thought, and writing to speech. Is it not the case that by saying that there can be a truth for the sign in general, we are assuming that the sign is not the possibility of truth, that the sign does not constitute truth, but is content to signify the truth, to reproduce it, to incarnate it, and to inscribe it secondarily or to refer to it? For if the sign somehow preceded what we call truth or essence, it would make no sense to speak of the truth or the essence of the sign. It is not possible to think, and doubtlessly Husserl has done this, that the sign, for example, if we consider the sign as a structure of an intentional movement, does not fall under the category of this thing in general, Sache. That the sign is not a being about whose being we would have just posed a question. Is not the sign something other than a being? is not the whole thing, which not being a thing does not fall under the question of what is? And in contrast, does not the science sometimes produce the question, thus produce philosophy as the empire of TSD? Orator's note, TSD means an investigation of that what is. Returning. By asserting that logical Bedeutung is an expression, there is a theoretical truth only in a statement. By engaging resolutely in a question concerning linguistic expression as the possibility of truth, by not presupposing the essential unity of the sign, Husserl could appear to reverse the direction of the traditional procedure and respect in the activity of signification what, having no truth itself, conditions the movement and the concept of truth. And, in fact, throughout an itinerary ends up at the origin of geometry. Husserl will give a growing attention to what in signification, in language, and in inscription, as it writes ideal objectivity down, produces truth or ideality, rather than records it. But this last movement is not simple. Here is our problem, and we will have to return to it. The historical destiny of phenomenology seems, no matter what, to be contained between these two motives. On the one hand, phenomenology is the reduction of a naive ontology, the return to an active constitution of sense and validity, to the activity of a life that produces truth and validity in general through its signs, but at the same time, without being simply juxtaposed to this movement, another necessity confirms also the classical metaphysics of presence and indicates that phenomenology belongs to classical ontology. We have chosen to be interested in this relation in which phenomenology belongs to classical ontology.